Seat, everyone. Good morning. Welcome back to Department 1, People versus Robert Durst. Mr. Durst is present with Mr. DeGuerin and Mr. Chesnoff. Council table, Mr. Henderson and Mr. Balian, Mr. Miata, Mr. Milius, and Mr. Lewin also are present for the people. All jurors and alternates have returned to the courtroom. It seems that you're continuing with the video testimony of Stewart Altman.
Mr. Ray is present.
Pardon me? Oh, Mr. Ray, good morning. Mr. Ray is present also. Thank you.
Yes, Your Honor, we can pick up where we left off. It's 3 hours, 7 minutes, and 30 seconds into the video. On the transcript, it's toward the end. I believe it's page 66. Video has turned itself off. What page number? 66.
Beverly Hills, Mr. Durst is present. Counsel, you represented Ms. Bond is present. The witness is aware. Mr. Altman, you remain under oath and you may receive your examination.
Mr. Altman, I want to go back to the time that Mr. Durst was incarcerated in Pennsylvania prior to his trial in Texas. Do you remember that time?
Yes.
Have you ever told Mr. Altman any media person during entertainment that the defense in the Galveston case was manufactured?
No.
Did you attend the trial in Galveston?
I was there for parts of it.
Did you sit with the attorney or did you sit in the audience?
Second,
What's that?
right behind the
In the audience?
the road reserved for the attorneys.
So did you sit in an attorney,
It was behind the bar.
an attorney section or in an audience section?
It was behind the bar. Reserved seats for attorneys.
Okay, so you sat in an area that was reserved for attorneys.
Yes.
I want to talk about your calls in New Orleans to Mr. Durst. Did you know those calls were being taped and monitored?
I knew there was, I heard it was one, and I received the call, and it was a pre-recorded message.
And Mr. Altman, you had experience directly with having your call monitored to Mr. Durst when he was in Pennsylvania, correct?
Yes.
And you were aware, because there had been extensive litigation about the fact that those Pennsylvania calls were recorded, is that correct?
Yes.
And you were aware that when Mr. Durst went into the Louisiana jail, even before you heard a recording, you knew from your experience, both with Mr. Durst and as a criminal defense attorney, that jail calls are monitored, correct?
They say they were subject to monitoring. That's what the announcement said.
It's not what I asked you. Let me list my question again.
Hopefully that's permanent.
Can we rewind it about 10 seconds?
Yeah.
We've only done 3 minutes.
Your Honor, I'm going to resume at 3:09:45.
All right.
The fact that those Pennsylvania calls were recorded, is that correct?
Yes.
And you were aware that when Mr. Durst went into the Louisiana jail, even before you heard a recording, you knew from your experience, both with Mr. Durst and as a criminal defense attorney, that jail calls are monitored, correct?
They say they were subject to monitoring, separately announced and said.
It's not what I asked you. Let me list my question again. Given your experience with Mr. Durst in Pennsylvania, and also given your history doing criminal defense work, prior to even hearing a warning on the New Orleans calls, didn't you expect that any conversation was going to be recorded?
I expected that.
What's that?
I expected the calls to be recorded, but I did notify them that I was an attorney and I didn't expect them to keep those calls.
I'm going to get to that. You started talking to Mr. Durst in Pennsylvania to talk to Mr. Durst in New Orleans months before any effort of notification was made. Is that correct?
I did tell them orally when I went to the jail that I was an attorney for Bob Durst, and I told them that I would be getting phone calls from him, and I expected them to respect the privilege.
When did you do that?
First day I went down there to visit.
So you're telling me, nothing in writing?
No, not until September.
So you're telling me, Mr. Altman, that on an issue of whether or not your calls were going to be recorded to your client in a murder case, that you simply made an oral request and didn't document anything in writing?
Right.
Does that sound, Mr. Altman, like the kind of work that you would expect would be done to safeguard such an important privilege?
Did I expect that kind of behavior? I don't say that.
As you sit here, Mr. Altman, does it sound like an effective work for you? That it was enough for you to simply give an oral statement to somebody in a jail that you didn't want anything recorded and not get something in writing?
No.
And in fact, Mr. Altman, you were familiar from your work with other defendants, correct? As to how jail monitoring works, correct?
In every state or every city, it seems to be different.
You were aware, Mr. Altman, correct, that the process that you knew had to happen was you give something in writing to the jail, and you give something in writing to the phone company, and you make sure that the jail is communicating with the phone company, correct?
I should have done that, I guess.
Is that your understanding, Mr. Altman, based on your 49 years of practice as to what the process is?
No, I don't have an understanding of what the process is. If I knew the process at that time, I would have already.
So you thought that it was sufficient for you to simply make an oral comment to the jail in Louisiana and not get anything in writing.
Right.
As you sit here today, do you believe, Mr. Altman, that that was a sufficiently effective way for you to assert that right?
No.
Are you aware, Mr. Altman, as you sit here, that if your conversations with Bob Durst can be characterized as attorney-client conversations, that they will not be able to be used, assuming there's a waiver? Are you aware of that?
So there's no way.
Assuming there's no waiver, are you aware of that?
Yes.
So as you sit here, would you agree that as Mr. Durst's friend, you have a motivation to try and make sure, if possible, that those calls are not able to be used against him in this proceeding? Would you agree?
As his attorney and as his yes.
I didn't ask you as his attorney, I said as his
I
friend.
can't answer the way you want me to. I'm telling you how I do it.
Are you aware that your wife testified about a letter she says that she sent to NCIC in September of 2015?
Yes.
Are you the one that dictated that letter?
I was given some help in getting that letter
By who?
by Chris Garcia.
Chris Garcia is one of Mr. Durst's attorneys, correct?
Gave me the name and address of the people to contact.
Mr. Altman, isn't it true that you were told by representatives of the Durst team that I had informed them months earlier that calls are being recorded, and that, you know what, if you were going to try to have privileged communications, that you needed to have set up that privilege through the jail and the phone company? What were you told?
Don't go in.
So, were you made aware that I had been the one to let the defense know that their calls were being recorded?
No.
The letter that your wife sent, that was sent at your instruction, correct?
Yes.
Did you instruct her to send the letter certified?
Yes.
And why would you send it certified?
I have proof of mailing.
Because it's going to be very important that you want to make sure they receive that letter, correct?
Yes.
And did you also instruct in the letter that they give you a response in writing?
No.
Aaron?
I don't recall.
Put it up.
Want to read it to me?
Oh, sure, I'll give it to you. Let me get the letter. While we're doing that, do you have the certified proof that you sent in registered mail?
No.
Mr. Altman, you're talking about privileged materials, confidential communications allegedly involving your client, correct?
Correct.
You've been a lawyer 49 years, and you're telling me that you instruct your wife to send this letter certified, and then you don't put the proof of that certification in a file?
Correct.
Mr. Altman, would you agree that the only proof we have that you ever sent that letter would be the testimony of you and your wife? Would you agree?
Yes.
Mark Peoples, next in order.
Next in order is 44.
Put this up. I want you to look, the part that I'm concerned about is it says, please acknowledge such to be in writing. Do you see that?
Yes.
Did you ever get anything back in writing?
No.
So, yeah, this People's 44, this is the letter that was sent by your wife allegedly, correct?
Correct.
Mr. Altman, is it your testimony that you believe that as soon as you sent that letter, whether there was any acknowledgement that it was received, whether a copy was sent to the jail itself, that as soon as you sent that letter, at that point in time, you had an expectation of privacy that your calls would not be monitored?
I had an expectation of privacy from day one.
Mr. Altman, if you believe that your calls were not being monitored and that you had an expectation of privacy, you wouldn't have a need to send that letter or to notify the jail not to record your calls, correct?
No.
Tell me how that's not correct, Mr. Altman.
I was trying to dot all the i's and cross all the t's.
Well, if you're trying to dot all the i's and cross all the t's, Mr. Altman, you're sending a letter approximately April, May, June, 6 months after Mr. Durst has gone into custody. You send a registered letter. Do you send a registered letter to the jail?
No.
Did you check with the jail's policy regarding whether or not they required you to send a letter to them?
No.
Mr. Altman, let me ask you, does it make sense to you, think about this, that a defendant's lawyer would be able to send a letter to the phone company without the involvement of the jail saying, don't record these calls on that authority alone? Does that make sense to you with 49 years of practice?
I told them in person that I was one father, one of the governors. They written that down. I saw them write it into their notes, in their books.
Let me ask you again, Mr. Altman. Would you agree that by simply sending a letter to the phone company from a criminal defendant with nothing from the jail itself, would you agree that there's no phone company in the world that you are aware of that would ever stop monitoring simply on that request? Do you agree?
No.
So, Mr. Altman, I want to give you the following hypothetical, given your 49 years in office. I'm a defense attorney who represents a drug cartel member. And I decide I don't want my calls monitored. So I send a letter to the phone company. On my letterhead, the defense attorney saying, you know what? Don't record those calls. Mr. Altman, are you telling me that you believe, reasonably, that a phone company, on the instruction of a defendant's lawyer, is going to not record calls?
Yes.
And I know that's what you thought originally. As you sit here today and you think about it, does that sound reasonable to you?
It sounded reasonable to me. Obviously, they didn't act that way.
I'm asking you, as you sit here today, does it sound reasonable, Mr. Altman, that a criminal defense attorney should be able to send a letter to a phone company that monitors jail calls saying, on my authority, do not record these calls? Does that sound reasonable as you sit here today?
20/20 hindsight. Today, it doesn't look like I did enough.
Okay, and Mr. Altman, once you sent the letter, do you agree that it's sent registered mail so that you can later on be able to document they received it?
Yes.
Can you explain any way, shape, or form how it is that you don't have in your file for this case a copy of that registered information, the fact that it was received? You requested a written response, correct?
I did not get a response.
You requested a written response, Mr. Altman, because as a lawyer, you understood that you wanted to make sure that not only they received your letter, but that they were following through with what you were requesting, correct?
Correct.
So is it your testimony to this court that you believed that once you sent a registered letter with no proof of registration and requesting a written response that you never got, that you thought right at that point you had done what was necessary to safeguard that those calls were not being monitored? Is that your testimony?
Yes.
Where is the signed copy of, I assume you signed a copy, correct?
Yes.
Referring to people's support for it.
Do you know where that is?
No.
Where's a copy that has your letterhead on it?
I don't know.
Do you know if your letterhead was even on what was sent?
Yes.
How do you know?
The office practice.
It's the office practice, isn't it, to send things certified and keep receipts, correct? Yes or no?
The office practice is to keep receipt, yes.
Is it the office practice to document when you're sending important letters regarding the monitoring of your client?
I don't understand the question.
Is it the office practice to document in your file that you have sent a letter requesting a written response?
Yes.
So is it fair to say that those are two practices in this case that your office did not follow?
Correct.
And I just want to make sure, Mr. Altman, is it your testimony under oath and potentially, Mr. Altman, with the potential issue of perjury, that you are telling this court that you sent this letter, you or your wife, that it was sent on or about September 14, 2015, to the jail certified?
We sent the letter. Yes, we sent the letter.
Mr. Altman, did you discuss on June 1st, 2015, at 8:20 p.m. in a call to the New Orleans jail with Mr. Durst, his efforts to manipulate and curry sympathy with the potential jury pool in this case?
Let's see, this is 44, 45.
45, SA 002, June 1st, 2015, 8:20.
You saw me on a newsreel or saw me on something, a TV channel or something, and you said that I didn't.
Yeah, right. I think you were when they picked you up in New Orleans, they were writing all sorts of good things, and they had a big.
Where did you say you saw me on a newsreel or saw me on something, a TV channel or something? And you said that I didn't.
Yeah, right. I think you were when they picked you up in New Orleans, they were writing all sorts of good things, and they had a picture of you when you were at the candy store, CVS, whatever it was, in Houston. They had a picture of you when you first got arrested in New Orleans, going to your arraignment. They had one of them still had the hair, another one's hair was like really short. You could almost see the sun in their head.
Yeah, I was doing it on purpose, and then I decided.
That's what I figured. I think you were showing people that you had the sun in your head.
Yes. That's
You're pretty smart, Bobby. You're very smart.
But you figured out exactly what I was doing. I was hoping I would get help, go easy on me because I was so sick.
That was your voice and Mr. Durst, correct?
Correct.
And that was Mr. Durst, and you discussing Mr. Durst telling you that he had deliberately made his hair short so his shunt would show and people would feel sorry for him, correct?
He said.
And that was you telling him, you're pretty smart, Bob, you're pretty smart. Correct?
That was me.
Let's talk about your jail visits when Bob Durst was in Pennsylvania and New Orleans. Would your wife also visit on occasion in both Pennsylvania and New Orleans?
Yes.
When you and your wife would visit Bob Durst in jail in Louisiana, when I say New Orleans, I mean Louisiana. So are we clear? Any of the facilities in Louisiana? Do you understand that?
We're clear.
And you, primarily, you saw him at Coleman Nelson, is that correct?
Correct.
So when I say Louisiana, I want you to assume I'm referring to Coleman Nelson. Do you understand that? when you and your wife would visit, you two, meaning you and Bob Durst, would meet separately. Your wife would not be in the same room, correct?
Correct.
And in fact, that's because you were allowed to have contact visits with Mr. Durst in an attorney room. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you did not designate for those visits your wife as your legal secretary so that she could accompany you on those visits, correct?
I did not designate.
And in fact, your wife would instead see Mr. Durst in the normal public area, correct?
That's correct.
And she would sign in as a friend, correct?
Correct.
And you were aware, Mr. Altman, that if you wanted to have attorney-client conversations between your wife and Mr. Durst, that they needed to be done in the attorney room, correct?
Correct.
So you were aware that any conversation that Mr. Durst had with Emily Altman that was not in the attorney room was going to be monitored, correct?
Correct.
And you were aware that those monitored visits were not privileged, correct?
Correct.
Why was it that you didn't have Emily Altman strike that? Would you agree, Mr. Altman, that the purpose for your wife going down there and talk to Bob Durst was not in service to him as your client, but as her friend?
She also assisted me with my legal work.
Well, if she was assisting you with your legal work,
Not during the visits, sir.
so let me explain again. When Mrs. Altman would go down there to visit Bob Durst, she was visiting him as a friend, correct?
Correct.
Mr. Altman, did you pick up tapes that you later discovered were Bob Durst practicing his testimony and delivered those to different charities while Mr. Durst was in Pennsylvania?
I never delivered any tapes with that, but I did take tapes.
Did you deliver tapes to your wife Emily to give to Deborah?
I destroyed the tapes.
Did you listen to the tapes first?
I can't remember what was on the tapes, but it was Bob practicing his testimony.
Did you listen to the tapes?
I said I heard him practicing his testimony.
I want to please play SA005. This is a call from
46A and 46.
SA005. January 9, 2025.
Now the doctor's making a story. Yeah, to tell you a little bit more, it sounds A+, so it sounds 100% believable. Oh, do you believe me? Yes. And the tone of my voice sounds sincere. Yes. Now the doctor's making a story. Yeah, to tell me a little bit more, it sounds A+, so it sounds 100% believable. Oh, do you believe me? Yes. And the tone of my voice sounds sincere. Yes. That's what I want to know about, those type of things. That's what I'm doing it, like now, like someone who's describing the situation. Yes. Well, only you and Stewart, you know, can I do this with? You know what I'm saying? Yes. But don't you see how important that is to agree and all that? Yeah, but I think that is a risk. But leaving out the risk, don't you think it's good to me to know that you and Stewart say, yes, you sound the way you should sound? Well, then that helps me.
Mr. Altman, were you involved, to the best of your memory, either yourself or through Emily, with picking up tapes from Bob Durst and delivering them to Deborah Jarrett?
No.
Do you recognize Bob's voice?
Yes.
Do you recognize Deborah Jarrett's voice?
Yes.
Or SA007, call January 11, 2002.
47A?
Thank you, Your Honor. At 1995.
So Stewart told me tomorrow, you know, he saw Emily for 5 minutes. She told me. Stewart told me that she's not going to get paid.
Did you tell Mr. Durst that Emily had stopped by to pick up the tape?
I don't recall the conversation. No.
Did you, in fact, end up getting those tapes at some point from Emily or from Deborah Jarrett?
I told you I got the tapes. I listened to them and destroyed them.
Have you ever, when Emily was met with Bob Durst, have you ever specifically assigned her a legal order saying, Emily, this is what you're supposed to be doing legally while you're meeting with Bob?
The meetings that she had with Bob, when? More specific, at jail?
Yes.
At the jail, she didn't meet with Bob privately. She met, as we discussed before, in the public section.
You've had a chance, are you familiar with the phone calls between Bob Durst and your wife Emily while he was incarcerated in Louisiana?
No.
You have not discussed any of those calls with your wife Emily?
No, I didn't discuss the calls.
Have you discussed Emily's calls with any of the lawyers representing Mr. Durst?
It was my own words, that's all.
Okay. And specifically, did that discussion about those calls with your lawyer happen after Emily Altman testified?
Yes.
Is it your testimony that you have never listened to any of the phone calls involving Bob and Emily?
Yes.
Is it correct, Mr. Altman, that the way that it would generally work when Bob Durst would call you while he was incarcerated in Louisiana is he never spoke to the two of you at the same time, correct?
Correct.
He would speak to one of you, and then he would speak to the other one, correct?
Correct.
And would you agree that those were separate conversations?
Yes.
And would you agree, Mr. Altman, that the conversations that your wife Emily was having with Mr. Durst on the phone, in those conversations that did not involve you, were not pursuant to your representation of Mr. Durst?
No.
Did you ever instruct your wife Emily Altman to specifically discuss attorney-client matters, specific issues on these calls with Bob Durst?
No.
Are you aware, Mr. Altman, that these calls consist of long discussions between Emily Altman and Bob Durst regarding things like their health? Are you aware of that?
Yes.
Are you aware that on these calls at times, Emily would say that she loves Bob and misses him?
Yes.
Would you agree, Mr. Altman, that any conversations about such personal matters would not be pursuant to your attorney-client relationship with him?
Yes.
Would you also agree, Mr. Altman, that you would never have your legal secretary talking to your client without you being involved, other than for ministerial functions?
No.
Please explain your answer.
I'm not going to go into what I do with my clients. I'm sorry.
But we have a recess for our reporter, let's not forget, who's working very hard. So we're back in session, and Mr. Durst is here with his lawyers. People represented, Mr. Altman is present with his lawyers. You remain under oath. You continue your examination.
Your Honor, before we begin, we marked as a 45-minute video clip, but no corresponding transcript. We marked as 45 days, no corresponding transcript.
Yes.
Mr. Altman, did you discuss on the Dateline episode that aired on 3/19/2015, did you make the following comment about all good things? Bob liked that movie, and that's why he got involved with Director.
Yes.
And I'm talking about non-privileged communications with Bob Durst. So with that proviso, have you spoken to Mr. Durst about the movie All Good Things?
I have, yes.
And in fact, did Mr. Durst tell you that he liked the movie?
Yes.
And in speaking to Mr. Durst at the time, was it Mr. Durst's understanding that that movie was basically saying that he had either himself personally murdered or had murdered 3 people?
No, he liked the fact that Ryan Gosling was playing it.
I can understand that. I can understand that, but I can tell you, your comment was not he liked the fact Ryan Gosling was playing him. Your comment was he liked the movie, correct?
Yes.
And that was despite the fact, am I correct, Mr. Altman, that the movie depicted Mr. Durst as having personally murdered or had murdered 3 people, correct?
No, I'm not going to answer that question that way. I can't.
Are you invoking attorney-client privilege?
No, I'm just saying that that's not what he said to me.
So tell me what he said.
He said he liked the movie.
Well, Mr. Altman, did he tell you, you know what? I like the fact Ryan Gosling played me, but I'm a little upset that the movie says I murdered 3 people.
That's going into attorney-client privilege. Really, I'm not going to answer that.
Okay. Let's talk about the BD story. Do you know what that is?
Yes, I do.
Do you recall you and your wife meeting with Andrew Jarecki on or about January 20, 2014?
Yes.
Do you recall after that meeting, you and your wife calling Mr. Jarecki about the box of material that Bob Durst had sent you?
I never called him.
Are you aware that your wife called Mr. Jarecki? What do you know about this box of materials?
Nothing.
Did you ever look at them?
No.
Do you agree that they were sent to your wife by Bob Durst?
Some of the contents were.
Do you agree, Mr. Altman, that it is your understanding that Mr. Durst instructed that those materials be given to Andrew Jarecki?
It's my understanding that she was under the impression that he told her to give directly all the things she had.
And was it also your understanding, Mr. Altman, that Mr. Durst had directed you and your wife, or you and or your wife, to provide any assistance and answer anything that Mr. Jarecki needed?
He said that.
Did you and or your wife end up giving Andrew Jarecki or and or his employees this box of materials?
I wasn't present. I didn't see what happened, but I was told later that she did it.
Were you aware, prior to your wife turning the materials over, did she tell you that Bob Durst had told her to give the items in the box to Andrew Jarecki?
We didn't have a list of the items in the box. I had no idea what was in there.
No, that's not my question.
He just said, give them what you have, is what I think she told him.
And so your understanding, you knew in advance that your wife was representing, that Bob Durst was telling her, give Andrew Jarecki the box and whatever contents it contained, correct?
Bob Durst told directly to get every information, and she told them to cooperate.
And you knew this in advance of her turning over the materials to Andrew Jarecki, correct?
The instructions?
Yes.
Yes.
And you did not do anything. You didn't tell your wife, don't turn those over. Those could be privileged materials, correct?
If I would have known the BB story was in that box, I would have had a fit.
You would have had a...
I didn't know it was in there, and I didn't know what she was giving me.
My question is not whether you yourself would have elected to have your client turn over the materials to Andrew Direct. My question is, it was your understanding that Bob Durst was telling your wife, he was instructing her, give them the materials in the box and no qualifications about not turning something over that was in the box, correct?
Correct.
Were you aware that your wife told Charles Bagley that Bob Durst had instructed her to give the items in the box direct?
I don't know what she told me.
There's an article from June 14, 2017. I'm just going to read to you the important parts that was previously marked when, what is it? People's 28. Is that quick to put it up? Part of the article I'm concerned with is the part that says, referring to the BD story, it was included in an unopened box of documents that Ms. Altman turned over to the makers of the chains at Mr. Durst's request. Mr. Durst had given the box to the Altmans to hold. Do you recall basically this article?
I recall the article.
And do you recall what I just told you?
Yeah.
And was that your understanding of what was to take place with the box?
Durst, I don't think Robert Durst ever sent us a box. I think these were just articles and papers that my wife was gathering and put them there. I don't think the box came from Robert Durst.
Did your wife, sorry, is it your understanding that Bob Durst told your wife to give the materials, which ended up including the BD story, to Andrew Direct?
He told her to give the materials to Andrew Direct. He never, to my knowledge, mentioned the BD story as one of the articles he wanted her to give to Direct.
You just mentioned have you ever seen the BD story before?
Yes.
You're familiar with its contents now, correct?
Yes.
But you had not seen it at the time that it had been turned over by your wife to Andrew Direct, correct?
Correct.
Do you know if your wife also turned over a copy of the BD story to Dateline?
Yes.
And in fact, that also, as you understand, was pursuant to instructions from Mr. Durst, correct?
I don't know the answer to that.
Did you and your wife beg Bob Durst not to do the interviews with Andrew Direct?
I begged him not to do it.
And you discussed this on Dateline, is that correct?
I don't recall.
I want to play EA 404. This is from Dateline, The Lost Years, Part 5. This is the June 2015 interview.
Are you marking it?
Yes.
48, 48A?
Yes.
Okay.
I begged him not to do it. I begged him not to do it.
Why he did it, only God knows.
What did he think he would get out of it? What would he be able to show that he's not a monster, he's not a horrible person? I said it.
Mr. Altman, that was you and your wife, correct?
Yes.
As a lawyer, Mr. Altman, have you had experiences where clients don't listen to you?
Yes.
Have you had experiences where clients do stupid things?
Yeah.
Are you aware of what's been called the bathroom audio?
Yes.
You heard that on the Jinx, correct?
Yes.
49 and 49A, this is again from the same Dateline interview from June 2015, EA 405.
What did you think of what you saw on? Oh, God. I just looked at Stewart, and he looked at me and we were speechless for a really long time, and I burst into tears. Because it just it was like a knife.
Was that your wife?
That's my wife.
Was that you sitting next to her?
I don't see me, but I was sitting there.
Ronnie, when you played again, you were...
I was sitting there.
Okay. Do you remember being asked that question?
I remember her being asked that question.
And did you correct her in any way when she said it?
No.
When you heard it, did you correct her?
I believe I said anything.
Do you know who Susan Giordano is?
Yes.
Have you ever had contact with Susan Giordano?
Once or twice.
Do you know Susan Giordano to be someone who's very close to Bob Durst?
I don't know anything about Susan Giordano.
Do you have any knowledge of the nature of Bob and Susan Giordano's relationship following Bob's arrest in Galveston from non-privileged sources?
I think she said she wanted to write a story or a book or something.
Are you aware that Bob Durst had Susan Giordano visit him in Texas during the Morse Blatt trial?
Yes.
Are you aware that Bob Durst would speak on the phone to Susan Giordano repeatedly after his 2015 New Orleans arrest and continues to do so till this day?
No, I wasn't.
Mr. Altman, are you aware that the defense attorneys in this case were picking up the jail calls that were being recorded in the New Orleans jail?
No.
Are you aware that Mr. Durst has given Susan Giordano hundreds of thousands of dollars?
No.
Have you had contact with Ms. Giordano at Mr. Durst's direction with his knowledge of both?
No.
Have you ever spoken to Susan Giordano about this case?
No.
Do you know if Susan Giordano is aware of your attorney-client relationship with Mr. Durst?
No.
Do you know if Mr. Giordano is aware of your wife's alleged your attorney-client relationship with Mr. Durst?
I'm not aware of anything about Susan Giordano or what she thought.
That was... As far as you know, Mr. Altman, are you and or your wife contingent beneficiaries of Mr. Durst's will?
I don't know anything about his will except what was said in court.
So, it's your position that until it was mentioned to your wife in court that you and your wife were contingent beneficiaries of valuable parts of Mr. Durst's estate in the event of the death of his wife, Deborah Sheridan, you have no idea.
Correct.
Are you aware that Mr. Durst is a wealthy man?
Yes, sir.
Tens of millions of dollars, correct?
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Altman, you would agree that as a contingent beneficiary, that if something were to happen to Deborah Sheridan, and you were the next contingent beneficiary, that would mean you would inherit that money, correct?
There's no way I'm going to outlive you.
I'm sorry?
There's no way I'm going to outlive that money.
Well, Mr. Altman, you certainly have some incentive to do so, that you agree, right?
I have an incentive to keep on living.
And you would agree, Mr. Altman, that the best case scenario is you have incentive to keep on living longer than Mr. Durst is, longer than Ms. Sheridan, correct?
I'm young enough to spend the money, I guess.
Well, are you aware that who is the contingent beneficiary in that will after you? Do you know?
I have no idea. I never seen the will. I didn't know about the will.
Would it surprise you if it was Emily Altman?
Yes.
Really? Do you know, would it surprise you if the contingent beneficiary after Emily Altman were your son Howard?
I'm surprised.
So, Mr. Altman, as you sit here today, would you agree that, again, that's an awful lot of money that could come your way if something happened to Mr. Durst or Ms. Sheridan?
Yes.
Would you agree, Mr. Altman, that if you are testifying in a way that negatively impacts Mr. Durst, you would agree that very likely that would lead to a scenario where you don't inherit anything. Would you agree?
I'm his lawyer. I'm not going to negatively impact if I could possibly help it. I told you that.
It's not my question. My question is, do you agree, Mr. Altman, that given that status as a contingent beneficiary, that if you were to testify in a way that negatively impacts Mr. Durst, you are aware that that is not going to be good for a future inheritance for either you, your wife, or your child?
I don't think I'll be changing the inheritance.
So you think that no matter what you say in court, you are close enough friends with him that you're going to be in that well?
I guess so.
Do you think that impacts your ability to be impartial?
No.
Nothing further.
Crosses.
Oh, John, I'm sorry. One more question. One more, sorry. Did you speak to Aaron Moriarty? Let me just play it. Essay 701, 48 hours, 321.15. This is
50 and 50A.
And this is a interview that was aired in March of 2015, but the interview is from 2003. Can I play it?
You would have thought she was trying to make a political life unlogic.
And you actually believe that the indictment was limited for something that he didn't do.
Yes, sir.
That was Mr. Durst. Was you discussing, correct, Mr. Durst's fears of the Kathy Durst investigation, correct?
Correct.
And Mr. Durst was afraid, communicated to you in a non-privileged fashion, which you related to 48 hours, that he was afraid that as a result of that investigation, that he was going to be charged with Kathy Durst's murder, correct?
I believe this was part of his, in the trial, it was public knowledge that he said that he went to Galveston because he was afraid that Gene Carroll, the district attorney of Westchester County, had reopened the investigation and was coming after him.
Cross-examination. Mr. DeGuerin, do you have any questions?
No questions.
May the witness be excused?
Ray's idea.
Right? You're excused, Mr. Altman.
Your Honor, there were 10 exhibits marked during the testimony of Stewart Altman. I'm going to mark the exhibit sheet as 174B. 174C was People's 21 in the video. It's a photograph. 174D was People's 25 in the video. That's a handwritten copy of the cadaver note. 174E is a 2-page transcript. That was People's 41A in the video. 174F is a 2-page transcript. That was People's 42A in the video. 174G is a 2-page transcript. That was People's 45A in the video. 174H is a 2-page transcript, which was People's 46A in the video. 174I is a 2-page transcript, which was People's 47A in the video. 174J is a 2-page transcript, which was People's 48A in the video. People's 174K is a 2-page transcript, which was People's 49A in the video. And finally, People's 174L is a 2-page transcript that was 50A in the video.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. 10:15 seems like a good time for a break until 10:30. Don't talk about the case or about any of the people or any subject involved in it with anyone, including the other jurors. Don't make up your mind about any issue until after you've discussed the case with the other jurors during deliberations. We'll see you at 10:30. There's a request yesterday that I instruct them again that I had permitted Mr. Durst to hire counsel for Mr. Altman. I thought that I had I had already instructed them about Mr. and Mrs. Altman, but if I left out Mr. Altman, I would repeat it. If not, I think it might be superfluous. I'll check my notes. Or
My
maybe,
memory is you said the Altman's plural.
I thought so too, but I'll check my notes.
Thank you. I think it bears repeating, Your Honor. After
Well, I don't want
so
to
much time.
unduly emphasize anything. So I'll check my notes and we'll talk again.